Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this week's installment of our Florida Talks at Home series. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director at Florida Humanities. We're so excited to bring you this program this evening. Truth be told, we wanted to do this program with Dr. Schliebaugh about presidents and crisis, and we figured that we wanted to schedule an election on the same day that or around the same day that we wanted to do this particular program. So that is why hopefully we all participated in our civic duty yesterday. Normally, Florida Humanities works to bring these programs with cultural partners around the state, but obviously we can't do that right now in person. So our goal is to make this virtual series of programs a regular event until we can convene again in person. I also want to let everyone know before we get started this evening that we're getting ready to conclude our special series on Florida's Black history. The Long History of Race Relations in Florida is a series of 4 programs that covers the struggle for civil rights and racial justice in Florida, spanning from European settlement in the 16th century to the present. The final program takes place on Tuesday, November 10th at 5 p.m. You can register for that program by going to our website, floridahumanities.org/events. At the end of tonight's program, you're going to receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill it out for us. Let us know how we did, how we can improve next time. By the way, if you have questions tonight for our speaker, type them into our chat field down below, and we'll do our best to work as many questions as possible in at the end of the presentation. Your support, by the way, is essential to helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to our organization. Your contributions help to make sure that these programs continue and that we can continue to bring them to a greater number of audiences. So again, tonight we want to welcome Dr. Michael Schliebaugh. He is an independent scholar who specializes in the history of the early Cold War, so from 1945 to 1965. He is the author of 3 books on the impact of the atomic bomb on American society in the 1950s, including Alert America, The Atomic Bomb, and This Show May Save Your Life. He currently teaches at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Miami. And so with that, we'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Schliebaugh.
Good evening, and appreciate taking the time to participate in this evening's program, Presidents in Crisis, their response, their resolve, and their leadership. I must admit up front that I've trying to grapple exactly with what's going on in our 2020 presidential election and how it fits into my presentation tonight. And I've been wavering between that maybe perhaps the election is a prologue to what I'm going to be talking about tonight, and then I waver and go the other way of maybe it's the epilogue to what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to leave that really up to you to decide whether it should come before or come after my presentation. Because what I want to do tonight is to look at how great presidents respond to crisis situations. And of course, the first thing we need to do is define exactly what a crisis is. So I define it this way. A national crisis is a situation or time at which the nation faces intense difficulty, uncertainty, danger, or a serious threat to people and the nation, mandating a necessity for a response to end the crisis. I mean, that's exactly what we have been facing this year. I think most of us would agree that this year in particular has been a crisis situation with the pandemic and the fears of recession, unemployment, small business going under, the stock market wavering. But from a historical point of view, there have been many types of crisis situations, and we'll talk about those tonight, from economic depression to racial unrest to massive, quick societal changes that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century, natural disasters, war, civil war. Depending on the time in history, different presidents have been forced to confront different situations. So, in a sense, there's really nothing new in terms of how presidents should respond. I think as an American citizen, I think what we all look for in presidential leadership are certain qualities. When you're faced with a situation that's threatening your way of life or the nation as a whole, you're looking toward a leader to exhibit these qualities. And here are just some of the qualities that historians have indicated that you want to look for in a leader. Empathy, being able to empathize with the needs and the feelings of the American people. Being very open to different ideas, not being so rigid, but willing to listen. The ability to communicate your ideas, your decisions to the American people. You definitely want someone that when it comes down to having to make a tough decision, has the confidence to do that. But at that same time, to really understand the limits of presidential power. You're looking for someone, a leader that expresses humility, yet has resolve and resilience. And we'll look at some of the men tonight that had tremendous resolve. You're also looking for honesty. We depend on our presidents to express the situation, and we look for them to be as honest as they can be with us, and dedication to really be committed to their responsibility in the office of the president. So these are the types of qualities that I want to talk about tonight. Just a minute when my PowerPoint, there we go. I want to talk about 8 presidents that each one exhibited in their own way tremendous leadership ability. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, Harry S. Truman, one of my favorite presidents, and John Kennedy. These are the 8 that we'll be talking about this evening in terms of how each of them was faced with a situation that they had to respond to, and looking at their response. And we started really at the beginning with George Washington. One thing I'd like to mention is just sort of my philosophy of really understanding the historical moment is trying to put yourself back in the period that we're looking at, where you don't really understand what the future is going to hold. Historians that kind of look back through time, they can analyze historical trends and see how things are changing. But I think to really understand the moment, you just kind of put yourself back in colonial America to a time that's very turbulent, the very uncertain future. And that really, I think, will let you appreciate the leadership of the men that we're going to be talking about. I think oftentimes when we say the word George Washington, the founding father, first president, we don't really acknowledge necessarily the fact that he did face incredible crisis situations. So what I've done is just kind of divided them into two sections. One is before the presidency. First and foremost, his job was to win the War of Independence. Nothing short of defeating the most powerful military force in the world, the Great Britain. And then he had to help actually write the document that would structure this new nation, the U.S. Constitution. Then once he's elected president, again, this is all written on paper. I mean, no one's come before him. So it's up to him to really define the role of the president. Then he has to ensure that the government is working, Congress is working, the Supreme Court is all functioning, coming from paper to reality. And then, of course, we are a very young nation, breaking off from Great Britain, but there's the French. His job is to position this brand new kindling nation and to gain the respect of the rest of the world. So he's coming into office, coming into adulthood, maneuvering all these things and learning really from a very young age is tremendous leadership skills. So what I like to do is, again, look at him from a military point of view and then from a more political point of view. In the French and Indian War, he's 22 years old. He is born in Virginia, becomes very wealthy at the age of 20 because of death of his father. He is a slave owner, but he decides, again, at the age of 22, he's going to volunteer to fight in the French and Indian War next to the British General Braddock. Then at the Battle of Monongahela, Braddock is killed. And so at age 22, Washington is forced to take command and credited with saving many, many British troops. So at a very young age, he's learning incredible skill. And in fact, in reality, he lost 2 horses. Many people, think that he probably should have been killed, but he wasn't. He survived, and as a result, goes back to Virginia, resigns, but becomes very well known in the colonies for what he had achieved in the French and Indian War. So when the colonists are beginning to explore the goal of breaking away from Great Britain, he's the obvious choice to be commander of the Continental Army. And even though when he was with the Virginia Regiment, he never really commanded that many in the Virginia Regiment itself, about 1,000. But there were more than 200,000 men that served in the Continental Army and about 48 to 50,000 at any one time. So he's learning the leadership skills and the command skills at a very early age. He translates those into his experience in the Continental Army. The war, of course, from 1775 to 1781, he never really wins a battle, but he never suffers numerous defeats, becomes what we would call a guerrilla fighter. He never surrenders his troops. And then eventually in 1781, he defeats Cornwallis and effectively wins the War of Independence. So again, in 1781, he's by far the most well-respected, well-known military hero. And when it came time, even though he resigned his commission and returned home and felt that his commitment to the formation of the nation had ended, when he was asked to be the president, there was no other person that could be president except for Washington. He decided that he would come back and become the president, and was one of the first president to be elected unanimously in the Electoral College. He's credited for building the new nation, and again, as I mentioned, taking what was just written on paper and turning it into reality. Just some of the precedents that he set as the first U.S. president. There was a lot of discussion about what people should call him, His Excellency. He just said, "Just call me Mr. President." When he took the oath of office, he added, "So help me God," which is now part of the oath. There was nothing requiring the president to address Congress, but he decided it was very important to do that, and actually is credited with starting the annual State of the Union. There was also nothing really about forming a cabinet in the Constitution. There was discussion about executive offices, Treasury, the military, and other types of offices. But what Washington did is he decided to bring them together in what we would call the cabinet, and listen to their ideas and meet with them on multiple occasions. And then, of course, maybe the most enlightening thing that he did was stepping down after 2 terms. He was in his mid-60s, but he decided that 2 terms as president, it was time for him to move on. So when we look at Washington as a great military leader who brought all that leadership, humility, empathy, understanding what the troops were going through, and understood his role, his responsibility, and the limits of his authority, as well as his responsibility in helping the nation get off the ground. This is just one quote that I found by Stephen Knott, who's a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, which I like. Washington's presidential restraint, solemnity, judiciousness, and nonpartisan stance created an image of presidential greatness or dignity that dominates the office even today. He was a man who could have been a king, but refused a crown and saved a republic. And again, when we look at all of these men, I think one of the things that we can say is how fortunate we were to have someone like Washington not only lead the Continental Army, but also lead the nation. Historians have named Abraham Lincoln as the #1 president in history in terms of his accomplishments. Again, when we look at Lincoln, we have to start early. He's born into an anti-slavery family. He becomes very outspoken on slavery, on the evils of slavery. He joins the militia at a very young age, as Washington did, although Lincoln did not end up going into battle. But then he turns to politics at a young age. And he really faced, as president, he faced three major issues, and I should say major in all caps. Number one, he had to win the Civil War. The nation had broken apart. He had to preserve the nation. He had to preserve what had been built and created by George Washington and the Founding Fathers. And finally, his goal, his mission, was to end slavery. So, again, coming into national politics with very little experience at the national level and becoming president, he really gained national stature from a speech he gave in New York early in 1860. And this is just an excerpt to illustrate Lincoln's real feelings toward slavery. And this is a quote from his speech. "Wrong as we think slavery is, we can yet afford to let it alone where it is, because that much is due to the necessity arising from its actual presence in the nation. But can we, while our votes will prevent it, allow it to spread into the national territories and to overrun us here in these free states? If our sense of duty forbids this, then let us stand by our duty, fearlessly and effectively." Essentially, what he is saying is that the time has come that if we believe that slavery is wrong, then we have to end it. So he comes into office in 1861, and this is what he faces. The Confederate States of America is formed in a month before Lincoln even takes office. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas all decide that they're going to secede from the Union to protect slavery. And then a month after he takes office, the South Carolina militia fires on Fort Sumter, the U.S. forces there, and the Civil War starts. So again, if you put yourself back in that period, he's elected, the South states succeed a month before he finally takes office, and then a month afterwards, there's a civil war threatening the very essence of what the Founding Fathers had created. And again, we can look back at 1860 as a long time in history, but in his case, it was really about 70 years from the time that the country became formed. And in his inaugural address, again, you can look at this and wonder, well, why isn't he trying to end slavery? But his main objective was to preserve the Union. As president, that was his duty. So he's saying, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery. And he really repeated that it wasn't his first priority was not to end slavery, but was to end the Civil War and to bring everyone back together. And then everything changed in 1863, January 1st, with the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he freed the slaves that were still under the control of the Confederate States of America. And some historians have said, that was more symbolic, and it was symbolic. There were about 4 million slaves, 3.5 million in the South, about 500,000 in the border states, and he did not free any of those slaves. And of the 3.5 million, only 78,000 were freed immediately. But the most important part of the Emancipation Proclamation is that it officially changed the goal of the Civil War from saving the Union to freeing the slaves. And from that point of view, it was perhaps one of the most important documents ever written. And when we look at Lincoln's legacy, we can say that in saving the Union, he saved the principles of the Declaration of Independence for his generation and for future generations, as well as using his powers to push through the 13th Amendment, that would end slavery. And kind of put this in context, the U.S. Constitution did not address slavery per se. It was a compromise by Washington and the other founding fathers from the North to get the South to ratify the Constitution, that they would put it back to the state level rather than putting it in the Constitution. So when Washington becomes president, even though he was very outspoken by that time about being opposed to the concept of slavery, he didn't have the authority, the constitutional authority, to end it. It was not in the Constitution. And remember, he's interpreting everything in writing sort of the first time. But in the Civil War, Lincoln very perceptively understood that in a war situation, he gained powers that went beyond the Constitution. And so he's basically using his war powers to end slavery, even though from a constitutional point of view, he did not have that authority. This is another historian, Michael Burlingame, who's written about Lincoln. Lincoln managed in the process of saving the Union and killing slavery to define the creation of a more perfect union in terms of liberty and economic equality that rallied the citizenry behind him. Because he understood that victory in both great causes depended upon purposeful and visionary presidential leadership, as well as the exercise of politically acceptable means, he left as his legacy a United States that was both whole and free. So, when we look at Lincoln in terms of his leadership, again, understanding what his powers were, understanding the importance of maintaining the Union at all costs, but having been opposed to slavery his entire life, his great accomplishment was ending slavery and pushing through the 13th Amendment, which was ratified, unfortunately, after his assassination in 1865. But when we look at both of these men, we can really respect how they viewed the world around them and able to take very positive leadership actions. I now want to turn to a president that I think a lot of people really don't know very much about Ulysses S. Grant, but historians are really beginning to appreciate him more and more as they look toward his accomplishments following the war. And I should mention up front that immediately following the war, again, he was the commander of the Union Army. He went into the South during the occupation, if you will, of the South in 1865, 1866. And it was during this time that he saw the racial hatred, discrimination, the violence that white Southerners unleashed against the freed slaves. And it made him understand the importance, even still as a general in the Army, of the government needing to move in and protect these 3.5 to 4 million African American former slaves. And that is, again, something that historians are really beginning to recognize his great achievements in that area. So these are the things he faced as he took office after Andrew Johnson. First, he had to reunite the nation. The nation was still separated when he began office. Then, as I mentioned, he needed to defend the rights of the freed African Americans. Part of the violence in the South came in the form of the new Ku Klux Klan, white violent organization that exhibited great violence against African Americans. And then, especially in his second term, to begin pushing through legislation to reform and update the government as it goes into the next phase of the country's growth. So again, coming into office with Washington really trying to create a nation, Lincoln trying to save a nation, and Grant trying to again reunite a nation, a broken nation, after the Civil War. Just to mention, I think growing up myself, I often read books where Robert E. Lee was really considered the greatest mind of the Civil War, but I think historians have really been able to look at Grant, who ultimately won the war, as really being a brilliant military strategist. He understood the role of his position, and again, commanding 1 million men, he really knew how to orchestrate victory, but displayed really incredible empathy and understanding of the defeated army, the Confederate Army. In fact, the story goes that immediately after the war, Andrew Johnson wanted to charge Robert E. Lee and other Southern generals with treason. And it was Ulysses S. Grant who went and said, we cannot do that. The goal is to unite the nation, not to punish. So Grant as president, again, you work with what were called the radical Republicans, who wanted to protect freed slaves. He established public credit. He rebuilt the Navy. One of the things that he, again, during this period, even though in the long term it really didn't work as well as he had hoped, in the late 1870s, there was really fear that the Indians, American Indians, would be exterminated, would be killed. And it was his administration that really changed that whole thinking and creating an American Indian Bureau, creating reservations, doing what he thought was best to try to get American Indians to settle and assimilate. Again, we can look back and realize that was not the right approach, but it did save thousands and thousands of Indian lives that might have been exterminated had he not attempted that. And then, of course, he used federal troops to go into the South and effectively destroyed the KKK, which would not come back until the 1920s. As president, he pushed through the 15th Amendment, which is the right to vote. And I think now people are really beginning to put him in the same category as Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson, for that matter, in terms of what they did for the freed slaves. Frederick Douglass, of course, the great abolitionist, said to him more than to any other man, the Negro owes his enfranchisement. And historian Ron Chernow, who has written the book Grant, which is a great book for anyone, Grant deserves an honored place in American history, second only to Lincoln, for what he did for the freed slaves. So again, he's finally getting the recognition I think that he deserves. And there again, kind of going through some of the things that Grant achieved as a presidential leader. He signed the Treaty of Washington, which up until this time, the relation with Great Britain and Canada, part of the Commonwealth, were shaky at best. But once he signed the Treaty of Washington, we've really been partners with Great Britain ever since. He protected the rights of freed slaves, pushed through the 15th Amendment. In his second term, which was, I think, known for its scandals and things that were going on in his administration, his response was to pass civil service reform. As I mentioned, he did his best to protect the American Indian. And then in the Panic of 1873, which is really the first Great Depression, where Congress wanted to just print money, basically called greenbacks, it was Grant that took a more conservative approach that the country needed to stay on the gold standard. And it's really Grant that started the transformation of the Republican Party into a more fiscally conservative party. I know we're moving through these at a fairly rapid pace, but I think the goal is just to really get a better sense of what some of these men and some of these presidents did in their own particular historical era to address the problems, the crises that they were faced with, and to do an extraordinary job. Roosevelt is very interesting because, again, you think, well, what was his crises? You know, the Spanish-American War really wasn't all that much. But we were moving into the 20th century. I mean, that's the most important thing. So, number one, he wanted to make sure that the U.S. military was prepared for things that were going on. For example, the Japanese and Russian war in the early 1900s. Roosevelt is beginning to recognize that we have to be prepared for a changing world military situation. Again, we kind of take it for granted today, but there was great expansion, Western expansion during this time. And Roosevelt was really concerned about future generations having the ability to enjoy nature and the wonders of the country the way he did. And he was very much an outdoorsman. And then finally, what I would consider the most incredible crisis situation, if you will, was bringing the nation from the 19th century into the 20th century. So what does that mean? What's going on in a period from 1890 to 1910, 1915, 25 year period, modernization. This is the era of cars, movies, things are beginning, modern appliances, the way of life is changing tremendously. Industrialization, large plants, people going to work, again, not so much doing the job from beginning to end, but on assembly lines. Then urbanization, which goes with immigration. 20 some odd million Americans coming through Ellis Island, most of them settling in urban areas, New York, Boston, Detroit, tremendous growth in large urban centers, especially in the East. Immigration, the immigration coming in the late 1800s and early 20th century were largely from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Polish, Russians, Jewish, Catholic, different cultures, different language. It was really changing the demographics. Then there was a migration. African Americans finally began moving north into these industrial areas, and segregation. Progressives, and Roosevelt being a progressive, felt that the best approach to a peaceful, calm, contented society was to segregate the races. All of these things are taking place. And by the 20th century, of course, we began with racial conflict and things that are happening even in the last part of his administration. So it's really Roosevelt who's coming into office with a very rapidly changing America. Again, where is he getting his sense of skills and his leadership ability? We all know about the Rough Riders. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley. The Spanish-American War starts. He decides that, again, he wants he sought a very rough life. Outdoorsman, forms the Rough Riders, who became very famous in the charge up Kettle Hill in 1898. And he comes home from the Spanish-American War as a war hero. And he runs as vice president under McKinley. McKinley is assassinated in 1901. Roosevelt becomes president and then runs on his own and is reelected or elected for the first time on his own as president. So 1901 to 1909, that same era where industrialization, urbanization, immigration, modernization, all of these things are taking place exactly at the moment that he's becoming president. Just a few of the things that he did. He's really known as the antitrust president, breaking up Northern Securities and Standard Oil. These trust and monopolies were setting prices that were very high, hurting the American people. He signed the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, which began regulating interstate railroad rates. Again, with the rapid change in our society, food preparation became very dangerous. He signs the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act. And then in conservation, he's credited with protecting from 150 and some say as much as 230 million acres of land for future generations. So in his presidency, he's really accomplishing a tremendous amount. If we keep moving here. Again, just to mention a couple of other things, on the more the military side, the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, basically telling Europe, you stay there, we'll take care of the Americas. And of course, probably the most controversial thing is Roosevelt supporting a revolution in Colombia, which led to the creation of Panama. And but in exchange, Panama agreed to build the Panama Canal, which Roosevelt felt was absolutely critical in order to move the military, the Navy, from the Pacific to the Atlantic in case of war. And he never really regretted that. So his legacy, he's a progressive. um, really redefining what the federal government should do, and again, protecting the environment. Franklin Roosevelt, who was a distant cousin of Theodore, what did he face? Again, we think, today we have problems, and Theodore Roosevelt. Well, Franklin Roosevelt comes in, wins the presidency in 1932, which is the darkest time of the Great Depression. Unemployment, business failures, banking collapse, and not only that, but it is a world depression. And so Roosevelt can see in Europe, you have Mussolini and Adolf Hitler also trying to bring their countries back, but in a militaristic way. And then, of course, December 7th, 1941, World War II, and Roosevelt takes us through and helps win the war. So again, just a little bit of background. He enters politics early, wins election in 1932 after being governor of New York. Of course, he contracts polio around 1925 as an adult. Not really going to go through these. I think we all know the acronyms, but these are the actions he took, kind of building off the Theodore Roosevelt's belief that the government needs to be stronger and more proactive. Roosevelt came in and within 100 days began pushing through a number of programs, again, to get the country back on track. He really established himself as an authority to end the economic collapse. He did what he felt he had to do. And his New Deal became extremely popular. It did have its detractors, but I think most Americans really endorsed what he was trying to do, of course, from Social Security to the FDIC, which we still have today. And then during the war, of course, two big decisions that he made, naming Dwight Eisenhower to lead the Allied troops in Europe, and approving the Manhattan Project for building the atomic bomb when Albert Einstein warned that Adolf Hitler might be trying to do the same. I think I mentioned earlier, Harry S. Truman is one of my favorites. Again, I'm a little bit partial. I'm from Independence, Missouri, Harry Truman's hometown. I've done research at the Truman Library, but he is really getting, I think, the recognition he deserves for coming into office at an extraordinarily difficult time. Number one, he only talks to Roosevelt once or twice after becoming vice president, and then he dies. He doesn't really know anything about the Manhattan Project, but within a few months has to make a decision about dropping the atomic bomb. Then the nation goes from war to peace, and Truman's job is to do that transition. Post-war racial discrimination, the same that happened in World War I. African-American GIs coming home, especially living in the South, were lynched and killed. In terms of international politics, the Soviet Union, which had been an ally in World War II, quickly becomes an enemy, and Stalin begins drawing what Winston Churchill calls an Iron Curtain across Eastern Europe. And then in 1949, to the month, just in August of 1949, 4 years after we dropped the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic bomb. So from 1945 to 1949, you can see the number of issues that Truman is being confronted with. Again, this is just a little bit about his background, becoming vice president and then president. And then, of course, no one believing that Truman would win election in 1948, but he proved everyone wrong. To go through just some of the actions that he took. One was making the decision to bring World War II to an end. Operation Downfall, which was the final attack of the Japanese mainland. Estimates were as up to 1 million casualties. So Truman made the very hard decision, which he never regretted, to bomb Hiroshima, and 3 days later to bomb Nagasaki and bring the war to an end. Again, not to go through all of these things, but just to show you the number of actions that Truman took, from the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, the Berlin airlift, pledging the United States to fight in the Korean War. One of his personal accomplishments that he felt most proud of was desegregating the military. When George Douglas MacArthur wanted to invade China, Truman made the decision to let him go. And after the Soviet Union exploded its atomic bomb, Truman made, again, a very forceful decision to launch the Federal Civil Defense Administration to prepare the nation for the probability of a war. As I mentioned, he was very proud of his civil rights actions. Executive Order 9981 and 9980, two acts, one desegregating the military and the other ending segregation in federal projects. I have two more presidents. Again, moving at a pretty rapid pace here. But John F. Kennedy only served from 1961 to 1963, but is considered, again, one of the great presidents and one of the great leaders. So in a very short time that he was president, these are the things that he faced, which were, again, extraordinary, which we'll talk about, the Berlin crisis. And then here in Florida, most of us are aware of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The escalation of the Cold War, even in the mid to late 1950s, nearly half of Americans believed there would be an atomic war. In 1952, the United States exploded a hydrogen bomb, which was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. It took the Soviet Union 4 years to develop an atomic bomb after we developed ours in 1945. But we exploded a hydrogen bomb in October 1952, and in July of 1953, the Soviets also had a hydrogen bomb. I put down here, again, I think it's maybe not as obvious, but I am a baby boomer. Some of you may be baby boomers. This really was the age historians have called the age of anxiety, the age of doubt. Of course, this is McCarthyism, the Red Scare. I think there were a lot of young people coming of age, really that first wave of the baby boom in the early 60s, that were very disillusioned with what the future would hold. And then also, Kennedy was being confronted with a slowly escalating issue of civil rights. Sit-ins, Little Rock, Arkansas, with desegregation, Rosa Parks with the bus boycott. Things are beginning to heat up. So in his very short time in office, these are the things he's dealing with. As we've seen, again, with Roosevelt, and with Washington. Kennedy is also a military hero, commanding PT boats during the war and receiving the Navy and Marine Corps medals. In 1960, of course, he defeated Richard Nixon, became the first Catholic president. The country was in a recession, really the second recession under Eisenhower, but he's credited with making the right decisions to pull us out. He increased Social Security payments, the minimum wage, established the Peace Corps, which is really aimed at helping young people, get a sense of purpose, and then pushing for anti-poverty legislation. This is his new frontier speech. It would be much more powerful to listen to him, but this is just an excerpt. The new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. It appeals to their pride, not to their pocketbook. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. My call is to the young in heart, regardless of age, to all who respond to the scriptural call, be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. Again, very quickly, in 1961, Khrushchev wants the U.S. to pull out of Berlin. Of course, after World War II, the Allies controlled West Berlin, which was about 100 miles inside of East Germany. Kennedy holds fast. Khrushchev backs down. A year later, Khrushchev is trying to move missiles into Cuba. Again, those of you that are a little bit older may remember Kennedy's speech, probably the most serious television address ever, warning that any attack anywhere in the Americas by the Soviet Union would warrant a full retaliatory attack by the United States. Historian Robert Dallek says simply, the presidency's central role to inspire and encourage the country to move forward was a role that Kennedy performed better than any president in modern memory. And last but not least, again, I think you saw earlier, historians have really put Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and Lyndon Johnson in the same category as the three presidents who really did the most for African Americans. And what did he face coming into office? Well, first and foremost, like Teddy Roosevelt, with Kennedy's assassination, his job was to continue Kennedy's policies and programs. Of course, the Cold War was continuing to escalate. Racial tension by 1963-64, additional sit-ins and protests and riots beginning to happen all over the country. And one thing that Johnson was very focused on was attacking the 15% of Americans that were considered in poverty. And finally, which really don't have time, it's a whole presentation by itself, is Vietnam. And unfortunately, it was Vietnam that really tainted his legacy, which is really quite impressive. Again, not mainly to throw this list at you, just to show the incredible breadth of what Johnson did. Probably more legislation passed during his administration since FDR. but the War on Poverty, Job Corps, Upward Bound, the food stamps, Project Head Start for young people. Then in the Great Society, reform for elementary and secondary education. He started public broadcasting, and of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what can we say about Johnson? Johnson's War on Poverty and his Great Society rank really with Roosevelt's New Deal, just in terms of making a commitment that the government had to be proactive. Also, his commitment to follow through on John Kennedy's programs with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So, I think I'm doing pretty well. Just, again, kind of pulling this all together. Washington built the nation. We can credit Abraham Lincoln for preserving the nation, doing what he needed to do as a leader to make sure that the Union was preserved, as well as ending slavery. Then Ulysses S. Grant, enduring Reconstruction, which I think is not really understood by many people, but it was his job to make sure the Confederate States came back, and by 1870, all the Confederate States had rejoined the Union. And then we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, who guided the nation into the 20th century during a time of tremendous demographic, economic, social, industrial change. FDR, both in the Depression and in World War II, must be credited with saving the nation. Harry S. Truman, during the post-war and the rise of the Soviet Union as an atomic power, as an atomic armed adversary, strengthened the nation, rebuilt Europe, did many things to make sure the United States was ready for the post-war Cold War. And then John Kennedy, again, in a very short period of his presidency, in the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, defending the nation, and through the Peace Corps, inspiring young people and inspiring the nation. And then Lyndon Johnson, who I say really uplifted the nation after the assassination of John Kennedy, with his Great Society and the War on Poverty. These are the 8 presidents, I think, that really stand out as true presidential leaders. Very briefly, I wanted to mention 2 more and very isolated examples, but George W. really doesn't belong, I think, in the breadth of FDR and Lincoln and Kennedy. But for those of you that can remember, his address to the American people following 9/11, I think, was extraordinary. And I think it really, probably to me, was the high point of his leadership in calming the nation and making sure that they understood that we were strong, that this terrorist attack was not going to tear us apart. And then finally, Barack Obama comes into office in 2008, and during the Great Recession, he pushes through a financial stimulus package for the banks. He gets through the Affordable Health Care Act, and he makes very strong strides toward climate change control. So again, just wanted to mention those 2 in particular, the highlights, I think, of their leadership. And then I want to leave you with this very nice quote by Harry S. Truman, which is something that we all just need to remind ourselves about. Men make history and not the other way around. In periods where there is no leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better. So with that, that concludes the PowerPoint presentation. I do have two short videos. One's actually audio that Keith is going to help me with. The first one is the farewell address by George Washington. It's just a short excerpt, but I just think the words are so powerful because what he is saying is that we as the American people have to guard against external or internal threats that try to break us apart. So with that, if I can ask Keith to play that for us.
The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, though often covertly and insidiously, directed, it is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as of the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts.
Again, link together the various parts. And the final video, I have to say, a historian that I really admire, Doris Kearns Goodwin, has written many, many books. And this is just a short interview commentary about her view of presidential leadership.
There seems to be a moment in a lot of leaders' lives where they feel like they've discovered that what they want to be is where they are, a leader of a business, a leader of an organization, or a leader of a country. And as one philosopher said, it's as if that voice within you says, this is the real me, this is my calling. So listening to different points of view and having on your team not just like-minded people, but people who can really debate things allows the leader, I think, to think through where he wants to go or she wants to go, and then persuade a greater group of people to go there. It's easier to think of great leaders as those that share credit for success, create a good feeling of morale among the team, acknowledge their errors and control their tempers, and have emotional intelligence. I mean, that's the modern and probably correct way of thinking of most leadership. So I think conquering oneself is the first thing that a leader has to do. And that often means coming through adversity with resilience. It often means self-reflection and learning about how you're developing. And most importantly, I think it means being able at each stage of your leadership development to be able to see, where am I? Why am I not further along than I want to be? Why did I fail at this?
Well, with that, again, I feel I threw a lot of information at you, but these 8 particular men really just stand out. They're the type of men that I think we look for when we think of presidential leadership. So with that, I'll turn this back over to Keith.
Thank you so much, Michael, I think, for that really fascinating and truly timely presentation and talking about presidential leadership. I do have a couple of questions I'd like to discuss with you. And if anyone also has questions that you would like to add into the conversation, feel free to type them into the chat, and certainly we'll work them in to our conversation for the balance of this evening. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, we talked about this a little bit before we came on the air this evening, is the fact that your degree, your doctorate, is in American Studies. And so there's a little bit of a different approach, I think, in talking about topics like this one in presidential leadership or leadership in crisis. So I wonder if you could just tell us, what is American Studies for those who might not be familiar with that discipline? And how do you think it changes your approach to talking about this type of topic compared to if you were, sort of this classically trained historian?
Well, again, as many of us who took American history in high school, even in college, and I really do love history, but the focus always was on politics, economics, military, lots of facts. The American Studies approach is very multidisciplinary and my background is and my education is in sociology, psychology, history, the arts, literature. The approach that someone with an American Studies background, I think in this presentation, perhaps the talk about Theodore Roosevelt, when you look at him as a leader, of my approaches, you have to understand the immigration during that period. You need to understand the modernization, the fact that, for example, in 1910, there were 10,000 movie theaters. How did that start to change the family dynamic and the social structure? And again, understanding the sociology or the psychology of not only the men themselves, but of the society. How is society changing? How is it being influenced? And how is the leader responding to these changes? So I really like, and I gravitated toward the American Studies approach, just because it seemed to give you a much better understanding that when you think about history, if you just think about our society today, it's not strictly politics or military, but it's social media, the social dynamics of the family, it's racial discrimination, it's unemployment, it's really the dynamics of our society really is what history is all about. So again, it's historians, history is part of my focus, but I think bringing in these other disciplines really makes it the era that you're studying much more meaningful.
Absolutely. And part of, it seems like what you talked about with Harry Truman being your favorite president, I imagine you've also had to visit presidential libraries and things like that, certainly with President Truman's library being located in Independence, Missouri, which, as you mentioned, is also where you're from. What for those who might not be familiar, I mean, what is a presidential library? What tends to be in these libraries? Is it just for members of academia to do like research and that sort of thing, or is it something that someone from the general public could potentially visit one of these libraries?
I mean, I recommend that everyone try to find a presidential library. It's Eisenhower has his library in Kansas, of course, Truman in Independence, Missouri. But what a presidential library, again, I think most of them follow the same formula. There's basically a historical museum. You might think of it as a gallery museum. The Truman Library being a great example. They have permanent historical artifacts on display from the Truman era, the 1945, the 1955, 60, including things like his car, things from the White House, a reproduction of his office, those kinds of things. Open to the public. Thousands and thousands of people visit the museum, and I'm sure every presidential museum. And then they do special exhibits. Truman has done post-war exhibits, Cold War. There was a great exhibit there. My interest in the atomic age. They had an exhibit on the atomic age and the atomic bomb. But then there's always the research element of every presidential museum. So the Truman Library and again, I think all the presidential libraries have a research arm that you can go into and register. You don't have to be a teacher. You can just be an independent scholar and sit in and have access to, literally thousands of documents from the era, whoever that president is, whether it was Clinton, Eisenhower, Truman. I did quite a bit of my research for my PhD at the Truman Library because that was my focus, was the 1945 to 1960 time period. So again, highly recommend presidential museums. They're really quite something.
And you did mention a little bit about the atomic age and the nuclear warfare. So I'd like to shift gears just for a minute. I know one of your particular specialties is about the atomic age and atomic warfare, and it's a little bit parallel to talking about, particularly during the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war that people sort of lived under. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, particularly for younger generations, where you become farther and farther removed from living under this prospect of of nuclear war, nuclear annihilation, and that sort of thing. Have you seen it as being a particular challenge in teaching, younger generations about, the atomic age, or have there been specific strategies or techniques that you might have used to talk about that topic?
Well, fortunately, I've had an opportunity to speak at museums around the country, and a lot of young people attend, and they're really very curious and interested in a time period they know little about, and trying to understand that, again, when we look back in time from 2020, and we can say, well, there's not been an atomic bomb in a war situation since 1945. But in 1950, a year after the Soviets exploded an atomic bomb, they were just 5 years removed from incredible destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. It was very real. And again, kind of bringing Harry Truman into this, in 1950, he signs the Civil Defense Act of 1950, and part of that act was creating the Federal Civil Defense Commission and the National Civil Defense Program. And I like to say to people that during this, especially in the 1950s, which is really the height of what historians call the age of anxiety, that even though people lived in suburbia and listened to rock and roll and worked in corporate environments, they would go home and be reminded constantly that the country was under the threat of an atomic attack. And one of the statistics I like to mention is that over a 10-year period of about 1950 and 1960, about 400 million pieces of literature, posters, pamphlets, handouts, books were published by the government in cooperation with private industry. It was a massive attempt. Civil defense programs nationwide, mock drills, city drills, regional drills, even national atomic drills. And I find that young people really don't quite understand what life was like during an era where the atomic bomb was still very real. It had not been exploded that many years ago in the Soviet Union, with expanding through Eastern Europe and developing a bomb and then a hydrogen bomb. Again, I'm not sure that schools are really teaching history the way that it should be taught, in terms of really enlightening younger generations in particular. But what's interesting is every so often, I'd say at least every 3 or 4 months, if you read a newspaper, there'll be something about an atomic or nuclear energy. It's still with us today, but I don't think people really appreciate what life was like, what I call life under the mushroom cloud back in the mid-century.
No, I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I provided for our viewers who are here tonight a link to your website if people are curious to learn more about some of your research and the work that you've done in talking about the atomic age and some of that culture. But I think the question that I would like to close with tonight, and this was something that we also discussed before we came on the air, is this sense of the country being able to produce the right leader at the right time. I mean, when you talk about this necessity to have someone who can navigate some very tricky questions in the initial formation of the country with the Constitution, having George Washington present, working through the Civil War, we're talking about World War II, the start of the Cold War, depressions, and all those things. And so in your research, in this sense for the country to just produce that right leader, what is it that allows that to happen? Is there just this sort of training ground that everyone seems to participate in that allows for that? Or, how is this seemingly possible?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasize is we're talking about tonight 8 presidents out of 40 presidents that are great leaders. So there are men that become president that don't distinguish themselves as a great leader. And as Doris Kearns Goodwin also often talks about, is the difference between, let's say, use this term, an ordinary president and a great president, is the early commitment and dedication and energy, if you will, that these men have to make a difference in the world. George Washington at age 22 goes off to war. Abraham Lincoln at age 23 runs for political office. Ulysses S. Grant goes to West Point at 17. Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman fought in the First World War. John Kennedy fighting in World War II. Part of the great leader doesn't begin with the day that they're elected president. I think it is a quality that they develop And we've been very fortunate in American history because the men we're talking about tonight became presidents at perhaps the most critical junctures of our history. The formation of the nation, the breakup of the nation, the reuniting of the nation, the incredible demographic changes at the turn of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II, the Soviet Union's rise in the post-war, and Kennedy and Johnson in the turbulent 60s. We were very, very fortunate that these particular leaders who were very committed, even Lyndon Johnson taught high school and often talked about his dedication to helping the poor because he saw the poor in the schools that he taught in. I don't have a magic formula, but I think when you look at a great leader, you have to look at the scope of his life. And again, as Doris Goodwin talks about, looking at those early signs that he has strength and courage, resilience, resolve, dedication, and a commitment to make a difference.
Well, and there certainly may not be that magic formula, but I think in this presentation and this conversation tonight, you sort of illuminated some of those ways and some of those commonalities that I think we look for in having some of those strong leaders. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and thank you to all the members of our audience who are able to join us this evening as well. You're going to receive a survey in your email. Again, we'd appreciate it if you could take just a couple minutes to fill it out. Let us know how we did, how we can improve programs for the next time. And we also hope that you'll go to our website, floridahumanities.org/events, to check out which talks we have coming up next and to sign up for them. So until then, thank you so much for joining us and looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.